History knew him as the man who brought the world to its knees, the mastermind of September 11th, the day when ordinary skies became weapons and the heart of America turned to ash before a watching world. The ghost America hunted for a decade, the face that turned faith into fear. But what if there was a far deeper side to his story that history missed? A side buried beneath the headlines, beneath the smoke, beneath the noise of a century at war. To understand how one man's faith became the world's fear, we must go back to where his story was first written under the Saudi sun in the year 1957. Osama bin Laden was born in 1957 to Hamida al-Attas and Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Saudi Arabia. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a self-made billionaire who rose from a poor Yemeni laborer to become the royal family's most trusted builder. But Osama's mother, Hamida al-Attas, was not part of that elite circle. His mother was a young Syrian woman from Latakia, elegant, independent, and different from the conservative Saudi wives around her. She was Muhammad's 10th wife, and Osama was her only child, with Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden. The bin Laden group's cranes and concrete helped shape Mecca, Medina, and the glittering palaces of the emerging oil kingdom. Osama was one of more than 50 children, raised among the hum of luxury cars, imported marble, and the constant praise that surrounded his father's name. From birth, his life was tied to both faith and fortune. But amid all that grandeur, Osama stood out for his quiet demeanor. Family members recall that he rarely joined in on the laughter of other children or the indulgences of wealth. He was tall, reserved, and observant, drawn more to solitude than celebration. Even as a boy, he seemed uneasy with the extravagance that defined his household. While other children dreamed of cars or football, Osama spent his evenings in prayer rooms, absorbing sermons that spoke of humility and purity. To him, material wealth felt like a distraction from something greater. Saudi Arabia in the 1960s was changing faster than any generation before it. The kingdom's oil wealth had turned sand into skylines, and Western influence began to flow through every corner of society, in fashion, education, and even architecture. For the royal class, modernization was a sign of progress. For the devout, it was a warning. Osama's world stood at a crossroads between sacred tradition and foreign ambition. The more the city glittered, the more his heart turned toward the simplicity of the desert. He was raised to respect both the Quran and the crown, yet he sensed a widening gap between the two. At family gatherings, his father spoke of contracts, construction, and loyalty to the king. At the mosque, imams spoke of judgment, sacrifice, and the path to righteousness. The young Osama began to wonder which voice truly represented obedience to God. These questions, small and silent at first, would one day evolve into convictions that shook the world. For now, they remained buried under the rituals of a privileged youth. By his teenage years, Osama's daily life mirrored the contradictions of his country. He studied in elite schools that praised progress, yet memorized scriptures that warned against Western ways. His friends saw him as disciplined, almost ascetic for his age. He avoided loud music, dressed simply, and preferred religious study over parties. Inside the young heir of the bin Laden dynasty, the tension between privilege and piety was already forming. History would later call him a terrorist. But here, he was simply a boy searching for moral clarity in a kingdom that worshipped both God and gold. In 1967, tragedy struck. Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, the empire's patriarch, died in a plane crash near Taif. The man who had built his fortune stone by stone was suddenly gone. Osama was just 10 years old. His father's death was more than a family loss. It left a spiritual hole in a household that had been built on obedience and order. The empire continued to thrive under corporate managers and royal contracts, but the absence of its moral center would profoundly shape the son who idolized him. For young Osama, his father's death carried both grief and symbolism. Mohammed bin Laden had been known not only as a businessman, but as a man of unwavering faith, a builder of mosques as much as palaces. The combination of wealth and devotion fascinated his son. After his passing, Osama began to see religion not just as guidance, but as a way to fill that emptiness. The boy who once walked behind his father's footsteps now turned inward, seeking answers that fortune could not provide. He began to find them in the Quran. At school, he became increasingly devout, reciting long passages and engaging in religious debates far beyond his peers' interests. Teachers noted his seriousness, his strict sense of morality, and his quiet conviction that life's purpose was not pleasure, but duty. He saw his father's empire as proof that wealth fades, but faith endures. The more he watched his family expand their business ties with the royal elite and Western companies, the more he withdrew into contemplation. Material comfort no longer inspired him, it troubled him. Saudi Arabia's booming economy drew engineers, pilots, and investors from the West. Oil companies brought in American advisors and British architects, all living under the same desert sky as the faithful. For Osama, this collision of cultures deepened his confusion. He admired the efficiency of Western systems, but felt a growing resentment toward their presence. He began to believe that something sacred was being compromised, that his country's soul was being sold for progress. In the silence of that realization, the path of the future began to take shape. At home, his father's portraits hung on the walls, reminders of duty, loyalty, and divine order. Osama would often sit beneath them, reflecting on what his father might have wanted from him. The young heir didn't want to build skyscrapers. He wanted to build purpose. That yearning, once personal, soon became political. Without realizing it, Osama bin Laden was stepping into a moral crusade, not against enemies abroad, but against the emptiness he saw growing within his own world. By the early 1970s, the boy from Riyadh had turned into a young man defined by piety. While many of his half-brothers pursued Western education, Osama stayed closer to home, attending al-Thagr Model School in Jeddah, where Islamic teachings blended with modern studies. Here, he spent long hours studying the Quran, Islamic law, and the Hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. His discipline impressed his teachers, who described him as quiet, obedient, and spiritually mature beyond his age. Saudi Arabia's religious establishment, rooted in the Wahhabi doctrine, shaped him profoundly. Wahhabism preached purity, obedience to God, and the rejection of innovation and Western influence. Its sermons condemned materialism and moral decay, emphasizing that Islam was not just a religion, but a total way of life. For Osama, these teachings provided structure and purpose. In them, he found answers to questions that wealth and privilege could never satisfy. The young man's sense of destiny began to harden around these ideas. In Jeddah's mosques, he encountered preachers who warned that Muslims were losing their spiritual strength by imitating the West. They spoke of a golden age that had been betrayed, an ummah, community, divided by greed and modernity. Osama listened intently, taking notes and discussing scripture with classmates who shared his devotion. He began to see his faith not as personal salvation, but as a collective duty. The idea of defending Islam, not just practicing it, became central to his identity. Outside the mosque, the contrast was unavoidable. American cars lined the streets, foreign workers built luxury hotels, and oil money fueled a new elite lifestyle. Osama watched his homeland transform with discomfort. The simplicity of faith seemed to be dissolving into material excess. He longed for the purity of the Prophet's time, a world before skyscrapers and foreign armies, before faith was a commodity. The call to prayer echoed differently for him now, not just as ritual, but as a reminder that his generation had something to prove. At home, he practiced austerity. He avoided loud gatherings, slept on a thin mat, and often spent nights reading the Quran by candlelight. Family members teased him for his seriousness, but he remained unmoved. The more the world around him embraced modernization, the more he embraced the past. His devotion was not rebellion yet, but it was the soil from which rebellion would grow. By the time he reached his late teens, Osama bin Laden's life was divided between two worlds, one of immense privilege and another of strict faith. To most, he was simply devout. To himself, he was beginning to feel chosen, as if born into wealth only to reject it for a higher cause. In 1973, Osama entered King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, a melting pot of students and ideas. It was there that he met Muhammad Qutb, a quiet but influential professor, and the younger brother of Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker executed in 1966 for opposing his government's alliance with the West. Sayyid Qutb's writings had electrified the Islamic world, arguing that modern societies had fallen into jahiliyyah, ignorance, and that Muslims must wage spiritual and political struggle to restore God's rule. Under Muhammad's teaching, these ideas found new disciples, and Osama bin Laden was among the most attentive. Qutb's lectures painted the modern world as morally bankrupt, poisoned by secularism and greed. He warned that Islam was not just under threat, but actively under siege from Western governments, media, and culture. Osama absorbed every word. For him, Qutb's worldview explained the unease he had felt his whole life. It wasn't just personal confusion, it was proof that the entire Muslim world had lost its way. The sermons became revelation. He began to view history as a battlefield, faith against corruption, purity against decay. University life gave him both access and influence. Wealth made him respected. Faith made him admired. He began hosting small study circles where students discussed the Quran, jihad, and moral reform. His charisma was quiet but firm, the kind that inspired rather than intimidated. The young man who once stood in awe of his father's empire now dreamed of a spiritual empire, a society ruled by God's law, untainted by Western ideals. It was an intoxicating mix of faith, certainty, and destiny. The Saudi state encouraged religious conservatism, but it feared radical interpretation. Still, within the safety of the university, ideological seeds spread freely. Qutb's teachings, whispered among young men, blended moral urgency with political anger. The 1970s were a time of global tension, oil crises, wars, revolutions, and within that chaos, young Muslims like Osama found purpose. They didn't see themselves as rebels, but as restorers of divine order. The notion that Islam must resist rather than adapt began to take hold. By the time Osama completed his studies, the transformation was clear. The boy who once questioned his father's wealth now questioned the legitimacy of entire governments. The same devotion that once made him humble now made him defiant. Faith was no longer private. It was his weapon of choice. And in Muhammad Qutb's classroom, he learned how belief could become a revolution. The 1970s drew to a close with Saudi Arabia, basking in oil wealth. And Osama bin Laden caught between admiration and anger. He watched Western engineers rebuild Mecca's infrastructure, their machinery parked beside pilgrims prostrating in prayer. The sight disturbed him deeply. To him, it symbolized everything that had gone wrong. A holy city reshaped by hands that did not share its faith. He felt a split within himself. One part grateful for progress, another convinced that modernization was desecration. The world was moving forward, but in his eyes, it was moving away from God. He began to see contradictions everywhere. In the royal palaces where his family dined with Western officials, he saw loyalty to money over morality. In universities, he saw students mimicking Western habits while quoting scripture. Even within his own home, the television played American shows, while the Quran sat untouched on the shelf. The young Osama carried these images like wounds. They were proof, he believed, that the Muslim world was losing its soul, piece by piece, deal by deal. When he prayed harder. When he studied longer. The more modern Saudi Arabia became, the more ancient his faith grew. He felt alienated from both worlds. Too rich for the devout, too devout for the rich, but in that isolation, conviction took root. He began to believe that his wealth was not a gift, but a test. Perhaps God had placed him among the elite not to join them, but to challenge them. Friends later recalled that he spoke of destiny often. He said faith was a form of discipline, not emotion. To him, the ultimate betrayal was comfort. The idea that Muslims could worship God while enjoying the same luxuries as the West. He admired simplicity, sacrifice, and struggle. And although he could not yet define it, he was already preparing himself for a larger mission, one that would demand both faith and defiance. By 1975, Osama bin Laden was no longer the silent son of a builder. He was a believer shaped by conflict, conviction, and contradiction. The kingdom around him was at its richest, his soul at its most restless. The stage was set for what came next, a call from beyond his borders that would awaken every conviction he had nurtured in silence. In December 1979, the Red Army stormed across the Amu Darya River into Afghanistan. For the world, it was another Cold War chapter. For Osama bin Laden, it was a prophecy fulfilled. The godless invaders had entered Muslim land. The invasion confirmed everything he had heard in Wahhabi sermons and from his Egyptian mentors. Islam was under siege, not just politically, but spiritually. The verses he once studied in Jeddah's classrooms now felt like commands, not lessons. Across the Middle East, Friday sermons thundered with outrage. Clerics called for jihad, framing the war as a sacred defense of Islam itself. Saudi Arabia's King Khaled authorized fundraising campaigns, while Western powers, led by the United States, saw the conflict as a chance to bleed the Soviet Union. The enemy of their enemy had become their opportunity. Between these two worlds of faith and politics, a young Saudi idealist found his calling. Osama could have stayed home, managing construction projects or expanding the family empire, but the invasion ignited something deeper, a longing for purpose. He poured his inheritance into the cause, buying trucks, tents, and medical supplies for refugees pouring into Pakistan. The images of burning villages and fleeing families reached him through newspapers and visiting clerics. Each photograph felt personal, as if history were asking him a question: what will you do for your faith? In 1980, he arrived in Peshawar, Pakistan, a frontier city transformed into the gateway of global jihad. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and desperation. Streets overflowed with wounded fighters, orphaned children, and preachers promising paradise for those who resisted. Osama walked through camps distributing food, paying for medical care, and speaking with commanders. To the displaced, he was a benefactor. To himself, he was finally living what he believed. Every shell crater and orphan's tear confirmed his conviction that God had chosen this generation for trial. He wrote to friends that Afghanistan was the field where faith is tested and truth is separated from lies. What began as charity was already evolving into crusade. The student from Jeddah had crossed a line, not of geography, but of identity. At first, Osama funded the war from a distance. He built supply lines, financed shelters, and bought weapons through intermediaries. But the closer he got to the front lines, the less satisfied he became with giving money, while others gave their lives. By 1982, he crossed into Afghanistan, entering the rugged mountains of Nangarhar province. It was his first taste of war, a world of smoke, prayer, and survival. The Soviet Air Force dominated the skies, dropping bombs that turned villages to ash. On the ground, Mujahideen fighters used American-supplied Stinger missiles and old rifles, fighting with equal parts faith and fury. Osama joined them not as commander, but as servant. He dug trenches, carried ammunition, and shared his food. His soft-spoken humility made him respected among hardened men who had known only brutality. Under fire, Osama experienced both fear and fascination. He later described the sweetness of jihad, but those close to him remembered his moments of terror too. Sleepless nights in freezing caves, trembling as shells exploded nearby. The contrast between fear and faith strengthened his belief that courage was a divine gift. If he survived the impossible, it must be for a purpose. He built roads for supply convoys and arranged burial sites for the fallen. Unlike foreign donors who stayed distant, he risked his life alongside the fighters. His ability to blend wealth and piety made him unique, a warrior with money, a patron with a rifle. To local commanders, his generosity was as valuable as his courage. The Mujahideen began calling him Abu Abdullah, a name uttered with reverence. In these mountains, Osama found what he had lacked in Saudi palaces: brotherhood. Each prayer before battle, each shared hardship, filled the void left by his father's death. He wrote home that Afghanistan was a university of faith. But amid that brotherhood, something darker was forming, a belief that struggle itself was the purest form of worship. By 1984, Osama's reputation reached another foreigner in Peshawar, Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric and veteran Islamist thinker. Azzam was a man of charisma and fire, preaching that jihad was not optional, but an individual duty for every Muslim. Together, they established Maktab al-Khadamat, MAC, the Services Bureau. Its purpose? To recruit, train, and fund foreign volunteers who would join the Afghan jihad. From a small office on Peshawar's University Road, MAK grew into an international pipeline. Donations poured in from mosques in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Gulf. Young men from North Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe arrived daily, passports stamped with destiny. MAK arranged their lodging, transport, and training. It was not yet terrorism, it was organization. Azzam's words gave the mission theology. Osama's wealth gave it structure. The United States, through the CYA's Operation Cyclone, funneled billions into Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, to arm the Mujahideen. Osama and Azzam never dealt directly with Americans, but their fighters used the same weapons and shared the same enemy. The irony of history was forming. The future's most wanted man building his dream under the umbrella of America's foreign policy. As MAC expanded, Osama personally supervised the construction of tunnels and fortresses near Khost and Tora Bora. His engineering background found purpose again, but this time in war. He financed a training camp called Al-Masada, the Lion's Den. Hundreds of recruits passed through its gates, learning discipline, endurance, and martyrdom ideology. To Osama, they were not soldiers, they were disciples. In 1989, tragedy struck. Abdullah Azzam was killed by a car bomb in Peshawar, an assassination never solved. To many, it was a loss. To Osama, it was a revelation. The voice of restraint was gone, and with it, the last check on his growing radicalism. Without Azzam's balance, MEC became less about defending Afghanistan and more about exporting jihad. The idea of al-Qaeda, the base, began as an internal file in those very offices. By early 1989, Soviet convoys rumbled out of Afghanistan through the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan. On February 15th, the last column crossed the border, ending a decade of occupation. The Red Army had been defeated by tribesmen armed with faith and foreign weapons. For Washington, it was a strategic victory. For Osama, it was divine proof. He saw in the Soviet collapse not politics but prophecy. The triumph of believers over the mightiest army on earth. He wrote, "The world has witnessed how faith destroys power when the cause is righteous." Those words were not celebration, they were warning. He interpreted the Soviet withdrawal as validation that God personally blessed their jihad. The mountains of Khost became sacred ground in his eyes, proof that divine will outweighed technology. He began preaching that this model could liberate all Muslim lands, including Palestine and the Arabian Peninsula. Among his men, he was now Sheikh Osama. He financed rebuilding efforts in war-torn areas, organized schools for orphans, and gave speeches urging Muslims to stay vigilant. Yet Afghanistan's victory was deceptive. Mujahideen factions soon turned on one another. Kabul burned again, this time from civil war. Osama watched as comrades who once prayed together killed each other for control. To him, it was not politics, it was apostasy. He felt betrayed by nationalism and disgusted by power struggles. In his eyes, the war had proven that faith could conquer, but humans had corrupted it afterward. He began to see jihad as a global mission, not limited to Afghanistan. The victory that should have brought peace instead deepened his conviction that only pure faith, untainted by politics, could save the world. As Western cameras celebrated Soviet defeat, Osama looked eastward toward new enemies. He told his followers, "We defeated one superpower. The next will fall the same way." It was no longer about Afghanistan, it was about destiny. When Osama returned to Saudi Arabia in 1989, he was greeted quietly, but with awe. In conservative circles, he was a hero, the man who helped defeat communism with prayer and courage. His family received him warmly, but the government watched uneasily. The royal court understood that admiration can become influence, and influence can become danger. Osama resumed preaching in mosques and meeting former fighters who returned from Afghanistan. Many carried the same fire he did, restless, idealistic, unwilling to go back to ordinary life. He told them the jihad must continue, that Islam faced new invaders, not Russians, but Western culture and American presence in the Gulf. The war might be over, but the mission had just begun. In quiet gatherings, he began forming an inner circle of trusted men. Ayman al-Zawahiri from Egypt, Mohammed Attaf, and other veterans. They discussed organizing a new structure, a base for future operations. From MAK's records and training camps, they began compiling a database of fighters and donors. This list, simply titled al-Qaeda, became the nucleus of a transnational movement. Meanwhile, the world celebrated peace. The Berlin Wall fell, and superpowers declared the Cold War finished. But in Osama's worldview, history had entered a new phase, the age of divine confrontation. He interpreted the fall of the Soviet Union as the start of a spiritual war between Islam and the West. Every Western presence in Muslim lands, every secular government, every modern reform was now an extension of that battle. By the decade's end, he was no longer the devout son of a builder, nor the humble fighter from coast. He was a man convinced that God had chosen him to reshape the world order. His letters began with Quranic verses and ended with warnings to unbelievers. Afghanistan had not cured his restlessness. It had crowned it. The student of faith had become its self-declared soldier. In 1989, Osama bin Laden returned home to Jeddah, a celebrated veteran of Afghanistan. Newspapers in the Arab world called him a hero of faith, the man who stood against the Soviets and won. To many young Muslims, he embodied courage and devotion, but to the Saudi royal family, he was something else, a symbol with the potential to inspire unrest. They greeted him politely, funded his charities, but kept him at a distance. For the first time, Osama realized he was admired by the people, but unwelcome by the powerful. That distance turned to tension in August 1990, when Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Saudi Arabia suddenly faced the threat of war on its borders. Osama saw it as the moment to prove his worth. He rushed to Riyadh and offered to defend the kingdom with his Afghan veterans, men who had already defeated one superpower. He proposed to build trenches along the northern border and promised to protect the Holy Lands without foreign help. It was both a patriotic gesture and a personal test of faith. The royal court heard him out, then declined. King Fahd chose a different defender, the United States. Within weeks, hundreds of American troops arrived on Saudi soil as part of Operation Desert Shield. For Osama, the decision felt like betrayal on a spiritual level. The kingdom that claimed to guard Islam's holiest sites had invited non-Muslim armies to stand watch over Mecca and Medina. To him, it was not strategy, it was apostasy. Friends say he was visibly shaken. He pleaded with clerics to speak out against the decision, quoting verses warning against alliances with infidels. Some clerics agreed privately, but remained silent out of fear. Others called him reckless. He began to see the Saudi state and its religious establishment as two faces of the same corruption, one political, the other spiritual. A storm was brewing, and this time it would be against his own rulers. By the end of the Gulf War in 1991, Osama watched American bases expand across the Arabian desert. He saw their flags near sacred sites and believed his nation had surrendered its soul. The warrior who once fought for the kingdom now saw himself fighting for its redemption. His new enemy was not Saddam Hussein. It was the house he was born to serve. For Osama, the sight of foreign boots on Arabian sand was the breaking point. He called it the Great Humiliation. American soldiers built bases near the holy city of Riyadh, drank Coca-Cola in cafes, and drove convoys past mosques. The image seared into his mind, his beloved country bowing to outsiders under the pretext of protection. He interpreted it not as safety, but as submission. If Afghanistan had been the battlefield of faith, Saudi Arabia was becoming the battlefield of betrayal. He spoke openly in gatherings, accusing the royal family of selling the honor of Islam. At mosques and university halls, young men gathered to hear him recount his Afghan victory and denounce the American presence. To them, he was the truth teller they had been waiting for, a man who spoke what others feared to say. But to the government, his words were sedition. The Interior Ministry began recording his lectures and tracking his meetings. He wrote letters to scholars and princes, warning that God's wrath would fall on those who trusted the West. When state-controlled clerics issued fatwas supporting the alliance, he called them false imams. In private, he lamented that the same people who once funded the Afghan jihad were now silencing its soldiers. Each rebuke from the palace hardened his faith that he was right and they were not. As the US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Osama's rage boiled. He watched CNN footage of bombings in Baghdad and interpreted it as a new crusade against Muslims. The rulers of Mecca, in his eyes, had become allies of the Crusaders. The humiliation was no longer national, it was civilizational. He vowed to expose it, even if it cost him everything. By the time the war ended, Osama had crossed a point of no return. He was no longer the state's hero, but its dissident. Government agents tailed him, press coverage of his speeches was banned, and clerics were warned not to associate with him. He withdrew into private circles, convinced that the Saudi throne had betrayed God and that faith demanded resistance, even against the king. By 1992, Osama's criticism had evolved into open defiance. He co-founded the Advice and Reform Committee, a group of clerics and intellectuals demanding transparency and an end to US military presence. They published petitions, quoted scripture, and called for return to true Islamic governance. For Osama, it was a moral uprising. For the royal family, it was a personal threat. The government responded with surveillance, censorship, and quiet intimidation. Saudi intelligence monitored his movements, and the press was ordered not to print his name. Phone lines were tapped, his lectures disrupted, and his funding frozen. Even his business contracts were suspended from government projects. But these efforts only strengthened his resolve. He believed persecution proved truth. The pattern he had seen in Afghanistan repeated. Faith thrived under pressure, and the state became the enemy of the faithful. In public, he remained composed. In private, his anger grew into certainty. He told close associates that the Saudi monarchy was no different from the Soviets. Both claimed power over what belonged only to God. He started meeting former Afghan fighters in secret to discuss the future of the jihad movement. The goal was no longer to defend a country. It was to reclaim an entire civilization from corruption. The government eventually confiscated his passport and restricted his travel. For months, he was effectively a prisoner in his own nation. Foreign journalists who once interviewed him were warned away. The war hero had become a ghost, watched, monitored, erased. But the more the state tried to silence him, the louder his message spread through cassette tapes and word of mouth. By 1994, the royal court had had enough. Osama was stripped of his citizenship and officially declared a threat to the state. It was a final excommunication. The Prince of Faith was now a political outcast. What Saudi Arabia lost in one decision was not just a citizen. It was the beginning of its most dangerous enemy. Banished from his homeland, Osama sought refuge in Sudan, a country then ruled by Islamist leader Omar al-Bashir and ideologue Hassan al-Turabi. In 1992, he arrived in Khartoum with family, bodyguards, and millions in assets. To the Sudanese government, he was a valuable ally, a man who could invest in their struggling economy and help build roads and airports. To Osama, Sudan was a safe harbor to regroup and plan. By day, he founded construction and agricultural companies, funding infrastructure projects and charities. His employees remembered him as frugal, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. By night, he met veterans of the Afghan War and radical clerics from across the region. Khartoum became a meeting ground for Islamist movements, Egyptian Jihad, Algerian GYA, Palestinian fighters, and Yemenis. Out of these networks, Osama began shaping his own. The organization took on a name he had first scribbled in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda, the base. It was no longer just a list of fighters, but an ideological hub. He used Sudan's business fronts to move money, build camps, and train recruits. To outsiders, he was a contractor. To insiders, he was a commander. The lines between commerce and conspiracy blurred, until they were indistinguishable. During these years, Osama's rhetoric grew sharper. He spoke of a new enemy, not just the Saudi royals, but the entire Western world. He issued fatwas calling for jihad against US interests in the Middle East. Training camps outside Khartoum and in the mountains of Togar and Soba trained hundreds of men. To Osama, Sudan was the laboratory for a global revolution. By 1995, Western intelligence agencies began to notice. The US State Department listed Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism. Pressure mounted on Khartoum to expel him. But for Osama, it was too late to turn back. He had built something far more durable than wealth, a network bound by faith, funds, and revenge. In 1996, the Saudi government formally froze his assets and revoked his passport. The man born into one of the wealthiest families in the kingdom was now stateless. His businesses in Sudan faced sanctions. His family disowned him, and foreign banks blocked his accounts. Yet Osama saw freedom in this loss. He told followers, "When the world takes away your comfort, God gives you clarity." Exile became the forge of his destiny. He moved deeper into Sudan's countryside, living on farms outside Khartoum. There, he trained fighters in discipline and faith, reading scripture before weapons drills. Every morning, he walked through fields barefoot, preaching austerity and sacrifice. He wrote letters to clerics in Egypt and Pakistan, calling for unity against what he called the new colonialism of America. The vision of global jihad was no longer a dream. It was his life's work. By 1996, international sanctions and diplomatic isolation forced Sudan's government to act. Under pressure from the United States, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, President Omar al-Bashir demanded that Osama leave the country. His presence had become a liability, a symbol of extremism that invited scrutiny on Khartoum. The man who once entered Sudan as a partner now left it as a fugitive. With little money, few allies, and no nation, he turned his eyes once again to the land that had made him, Afghanistan. Before his departure, he gathered his closest followers in a small compound outside Khartoum. They prayed, packed weapons and documents, and swore allegiance to a new mission. Not the defense of one country, but a global war against what he called the American Empire. He promised them that exile was divine preparation, that their suffering was proof of God's selection. Just as the prophet was driven from his home, he said, so too must we leave ours to fulfill destiny. For his followers, it was a sacred exodus. As his convoy crossed the desert toward Pakistan, Osama's world had changed completely. He had gone from prince to pariah, from builder to destroyer. Yet in his own eyes, he had never been more certain of purpose. He had lost his wealth, his citizenship, and his fatherland, but gained a belief that his cause now transcended borders. The man the Saudis tried to silence was now free from any earthly authority. The Afghan mountains awaited him once again, but this time he was not returning as a volunteer. He was returning as a leader. The small network he had built in Sudan was hardened by exile, disciplined by loss, and united by revenge. They would regroup in the ruins of a new Afghanistan, now fractured by civil war, and rebuild under the banner of al-Qaeda. Osama's transformation was complete. The disowned son of Arabia had become the self-proclaimed defender of Islam. He would never again walk freely in his homeland, never again speak in its mosques, never again touch the soil of Mecca. Yet from that distance, he would wage his greatest war. What began as a protest in the streets of Jeddah would soon echo across oceans and capitals. In exile, Osama bin Laden stopped being a man of faith and became something far more dangerous, a man of destiny. The country he returned to was no longer a battlefield between superpowers, but a ruin of warlords. Cities were shattered, civilians starved, and gunfire replaced the government. Rising from the wreckage was a new force. The Taliban, a puritanical movement of young religious students led by Mullah Muhammad Omar. They promised order through faith and saw in Osama a man whose conviction matched their own. The Taliban gave him refuge in exchange for money, expertise, and loyalty. He first settled near Jalalabad, then moved south to Kandahar, the Taliban's stronghold. There, he was received not as a fugitive, but as a guest of honor. Using his engineering background, he transformed the remnants of old Soviet bases into training compounds. At night, the desert flickered, with the light of drills and prayers, the rebirth of a war that had never truly ended. By late 1996, his network began to grow again. Fighters from Egypt, Yemen, and Chechnya arrived by truck and foot, drawn by stories of the man who had humbled the Soviets. They called him Sheikh Osama, a title mixing reverence and militancy. The camps near Kandahar became more than military schools. They became ideological factories. Trainees studied theology by dawn and detonations by dusk. He also rebuilt his propaganda apparatus. Foreign journalists were invited to record his words, believing they were interviewing an exiled preacher. In truth, they were documenting a resurrection. "We are preparing generations who will know no compromise," he told one reporter. He spoke softly, eyes unwavering, as if announcing destiny rather than war. The recordings spread across the Middle East, igniting whispers of a man chosen by God to challenge empires. By the year's end, Osama had evolved from an exile into the nucleus of a new movement. Kandahar's desert had become his capital, and his followers, the first true members of al-Qaeda, pledged allegiance not to land or leader, but to a mission without borders. For the first time since Afghanistan's victory, he felt certain he had rediscovered purpose. The world, however, had no idea what that purpose meant. In August 1996, Osama issued a manifesto titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. It was written from the mountains of Afghanistan, but addressed to the entire Muslim world. In it, he accused the United States of desecrating sacred soil by stationing troops in Saudi Arabia and blamed Washington for supporting corrupt Arab monarchs and the oppression of Palestinians. It was not a plea, it was a decree, the first open call for global jihad. He declared that killing Americans and their allies was an individual duty for every Muslim. To his followers, the document read like scripture. To Western governments, it was dismissed as rhetoric from a man in exile. Intelligence reports noted it, but underestimated its reach. In mosques from Karachi to Cairo, cassette tapes of his speeches circulated, filled with words that fused religion and rage. The language was deliberate, each verse echoing the cadence of holy text. The Taliban, meanwhile, strengthened their hold on Afghanistan, capturing Kabul in September 1996. Their victory gave Osama the perfect shelter, a state within chaos. Under their protection, he expanded al-Qaeda's structure. He appointed Ayman al-Zawahiri as his ideological deputy, Mohammed Atef as military chief, and created training sites such as Al-Farouk Camp. The organization began operating like a clandestine army, complete with codes, ranks, and doctrine. By 1997, Osama's image was being broadcast across Arab television. On Al Jazeera, he appeared in interviews framed by rifles and verses, calm and articulate. He spoke of humiliation, of duty, of divine promise. To the disillusioned youth of a divided Middle East, he was both preacher and warrior, the voice that dared say what others feared. Governments condemned him, thousands admired him. His myth was spreading faster than his message. In one interview, he was asked what he sought from America. He replied, "Freedom for our holy lands, and if not through words, then through deeds." It was a quiet prophecy. His declaration was not a threat in ink, but an outline for violence. Somewhere between the desert and the cameras, ideology had found its weapon. 2 years later, on August 7th, 1998, twin trucks packed with explosives rolled toward U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. At 10:30 a.m., both detonated within minutes of each other. The explosions killed 224 people, 12 Americans and more than 200 Africans, and wounded over 4,000. Glass rained down like shards of sunlight. In Nairobi, a nearby mosque collapsed. In Dar es Salaam, hospital windows blew out. The targets were American, but the victims were the world. Within hours, investigators traced the attacks to al-Qaeda operatives who had trained in Afghanistan. The operation's timing, exactly 8 years after US troops entered Saudi Arabia, was no coincidence. It was Osama's message written in fire, a reminder of betrayal now paid in blood. Across newsrooms, his name appeared in bold for the first time. The man once ignored as an exile had become the most wanted figure on Earth. In retaliation, President Bill Clinton ordered Operation Infinite Reach. On August 20th, 1998, 79 Tomahawk missiles struck suspected training camps in Khost, Afghanistan, and a pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum, Sudan. The strikes missed Osama by hours. Cameras showed only dust and smoke rising from empty desert. To many Muslims, the bombings looked like arrogance, America punishing a country instead of a man. Osama's popularity soared. That night in Kandahar, he watched the news silently. An aide recalled him smiling faintly, saying, "Now they have declared war." To him, the missiles confirmed his importance. The strongest nation on Earth had failed to kill him. Among his followers, survival became proof of divine protection. He told them, "When the enemy strikes, it means we have struck their fear." The embassy bombings changed everything. The United States formally indicted Osama bin Laden for murder and terrorism, placing a $5 million bounty on his head. Yet the attacks did more than provoke justice. They globalized his war. In his mind, the embassies were not the end, but the opening act. The world had finally heard his declaration, and he had their attention. On October 12, 2000, the USS Cole, a US Navy destroyer, docked at the port of Aden in Yemen for refueling. It was a calm Thursday morning. As sailors prepared for lunch, a small boat carrying 2 men drifted toward the ship's port side. At 11:18 a.m., the boat exploded, ripping a 40-foot hole through the steel hull. 17 sailors were killed instantly, and 39 were injured. The blast lifted water and fire into the sky. A $250 million vessel crippled by a boat worth less than $10,000. The attack bore the unmistakable fingerprints of al-Qaeda: patience, precision, and symbolism. Yemen was Osama's ancestral home, and striking there was personal. Investigators discovered the attackers had trained at Al Farouk camp and were financed through charities disguised as humanitarian aid. The message was surgical: the world's mightiest navy humbled by two men and faith. Osama watched the aftermath through grainy television clips smuggled into Kandahar. When asked if he ordered it, he neither confirmed nor denied. Instead, he said softly, "Faith can sink ships." His men cheered. Western analysts debated his involvement, but his network understood the truth. This was rehearsal. The response from Washington was cautious. Investigations, condemnation, but no retaliation. To Osama, restraint equaled weakness. He interpreted the silence as divine permission to proceed. "They are afraid of shadows," he told his followers. The perception of Western vulnerability became his greatest weapon. He concluded that a single decisive blow could bring America to its knees, just as it had the Soviets. The thought was no longer fantasy, it was strategy. By the year's end, al-Qaeda's hierarchy had solidified. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed proposed a new operation, an attack on the American homeland itself. Osama approved in principle, but demanded patience. "We must strike not where they expect," he said, "but where they feel untouchable." That command would define the next chapter of history. In 1999, Osama convened his closest operatives in Kandahar: Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mohammed Atef, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. There, KSM presented a bold plan: hijack commercial airliners and use them as weapons against US landmarks. The concept was audacious, almost unimaginable. Osama listened silently, stroking his beard, then said, "Yes, but do not speak of it yet." From that meeting, the outline of 9/11 was born. Throughout 2000 and 2001, the network trained men chosen for discipline and obedience. Recruits like Muhammad Atta and Marwan al-Shehi traveled to flight schools in Florida and Arizona under student visas. Money was wired through Gulf charities and meetings held in Malaysia and Hamburg. Their lives appeared ordinary: rent receipts, gym memberships, driving lessons, masks, hiding apocalypse. Osama oversaw preparations from Kandahar and later Tora Bora. He reviewed progress reports and recorded new video statements, cloaking his intentions in poetry. To his followers, he spoke of prophecy. To the world, he spoke of grievance. He described America as a body without soul, rich in power, poor in faith. Every sermon became a rehearsal for the act that would test that belief. By mid-2001, the plot was nearly complete. Hijackers practiced prayers of farewell, filmed martyr messages, and memorized Quranic verses for the journey. The Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and the US Capitol were identified as symbols of pride to be turned into smoke. Osama's orders were clear: strike them in their heart so they will never forget. On September 9th, 2001, two al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists assassinated Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shah Massoud, clearing the path for Taliban cooperation. 2 days later, 19 men boarded 4 planes across the United States. They carried no armies, only box cutters, devotion, and a mission Osama had crafted in silence. What began in the mountains was now headed for the skies. It was a clear Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. The skies over the East Coast were cloudless, the kind pilots describe as perfect. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 lifted off from Boston's Logan Airport, bound for Los Angeles. On board were 92 people, businessmen, students, parents, and 5 hijackers. Nothing in the calm of the cabin betrayed the war that had quietly boarded with them. At 8:14 a.m., Flight 11 stopped responding to air traffic control. Its transponder was turned off, a small, silent act that went unnoticed for minutes. At the same time, United Airlines Flight 175 departed from the same airport, also bound for Los Angeles, also carrying hijackers. Two other flights, American 77 from Washington Dulles and United 93 from Newark, would soon follow. Each aircraft carried ordinary passengers, unaware they were part of a coordinated assault years in the making. In air traffic centers, confusion spread. Controllers believed Flight 11 was experiencing technical issues. No one imagined the unimaginable. The plane veered sharply south toward Manhattan, descending fast. On the radar screens, a blip that should have been cruising over New York at 30,000 feet was now dropping toward the city's skyline. At 8:46 a.m., the silence of a perfect morning shattered. Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors at over 450 miles per hour. The impact tore through steel and glass, igniting 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. Fire and smoke billowed against a sky so blue it felt almost cruel. For the first 2 minutes, confusion reigned. A plane crash, a malfunction, a tragic accident. Emergency services rushed to Lower Manhattan. Office workers stared from windows across the city, watching fire consume the tower's upper floors. Television networks cut to live coverage, narrating disbelief. No one yet understood that history had just split in two. The day's calm had turned to catastrophe, and the next act was already in motion. At 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes after the first impact, United Airlines Flight 175 banked sharply over the Hudson River and plunged into the South Tower. The explosion engulfed the building in flame, sending debris raining across the streets below. Live cameras captured the moment in real time. The second strike erased all doubt. America was under attack. The shock rippled through every newsroom and home. Reporters fell silent on air. People in the streets screamed, pointing skyward as fireballs bloomed against the glass skyline. Inside the towers, chaos turned to terror. Stairwells filled with smoke and desperate voices. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics raced upward into flames, while thousands fled downward through darkness and debris. From the 100th floor of the North Tower, trapped workers called 911, describing unbearable heat and vanishing air. Some broke windows for oxygen, others held hands and prayed. At 9:37 a.m., the crisis widened. American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, killing 184 people. The headquarters of the world's most powerful military had been struck in daylight. In Manhattan, the twin fires burned like twin suns. Heat melted steel. Floors collapsed upon floors. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower buckled. The structure disintegrated in 10 seconds, sending a wave of ash and glass through the streets. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. What had taken years to build fell in less than 30 minutes. The skyline of New York and the sense of American invincibility collapsed together. Dust clouds rolled through the city like storms. Sirens wailed. Survivors stumbled through a gray haze that turned day into dusk. The world watched, live and helpless, as the towers vanished into history. What had begun as disbelief became horror. What had been architecture was now a graveyard. While smoke rose from Manhattan and Washington, another drama unfolded in the skies over Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 had departed Newark at 8:42 a.m., bound for San Francisco. By 9:28 a.m., it too had been hijacked. Passengers, learning from phone calls that other planes had hit the towers, realized their fate. Over the next 30 minutes, they made a decision that changed the final chapter of the attack. Armed with a food cart and sheer resolve, the passengers fought back. "Let's roll," said Todd Beamer. The last words heard before they charged the cockpit. At 10:03 a.m., the plane crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all 44 on board. Investigators later confirmed that the hijackers had been aiming for the U.S. Capitol or the White House. Because of those passengers, Washington's heart remained standing. At the Pentagon, fires burned through 5 stories of the West Wing. Rescue workers formed human chains to carry the injured. The building's exterior, blackened and shattered, symbolized the nation's shock. By 10:30 a.m., President George W. Bush, aboard Air Force One, was briefed. The United States was under coordinated attack. Fighter jets took to the skies. The Federal Aviation Administration ordered every plane in American airspace to land. Across the country, airports fell silent. Cities emptied. Parents rushed to schools. Strangers embraced in the streets. In New York, first responders searched through smoking ruins for survivors. Their radios crackled with names that never answered back. Firefighters climbed over twisted steel, still glowing with heat. Many of them never came down again. In less than 2 hours, the unthinkable had unfolded. 4 hijackings, 3 targets destroyed, nearly 3,000 lives lost from 93 nations. It was not just an American tragedy, it was global, an attack on humanity itself. From the burning towers came voices, calm, terrified, human. On recorded phone calls, trapped victims told loved ones goodbye. "I love you. Tell the kids I love them." Flight attendants whispered emergency updates before their lines went silent. In offices above the impact zones, people huddled together, choosing faith over fear in their final minutes. Their words, broadcast later, became the voice of an entire generation's trauma. On the ground, paramedics and police officers coordinated rescues amid falling debris. One firefighter radioed, "We're heading up." Moments later, his signal vanished. Reporters described scenes of chaos and courage. Strangers carrying each other through smoke, doctors turning sidewalks into triage wards, priests giving last rites in the streets. For those who survived, the memories remained etched deeper than the scars. In mosques, churches, and synagogues across America, people prayed side by side. Religion, often a source of division, became a momentary refuge of unity. The same faith that extremists claimed to defend now became a language of mourning. Candlelight vigils spread through cities around the world. "We are all New Yorkers," read signs in London, Paris, and Cairo. Meanwhile, millions watched the footage replay endlessly. Planes, impact, collapse. Each repetition carved disbelief into pain. The images transcended language. The world had witnessed death live. The illusion of safety, of distance, of control. All gone in a morning's span. The sky had become the enemy. In the hours after the attacks, cell lines jammed, and silence fell over the airwaves. New York's skyline was reduced to smoke. But in that silence came something defiant. Resilience. Survivors staggered from rubble, covered in dust, carrying flags. It was grief, but it was also beginning. The first heartbeat of recovery amid ruin. Half a world away, in the mountains of Afghanistan, word reached Osama bin Laden's compound. Witnesses recalled muted celebrations, quiet smiles, whispered prayers of gratitude. The man who had imagined this moment watched news broadcasts from a satellite feed. He said little, only, "America will never feel safe again." His prophecy had turned to reality. For his followers, it was vindication. For the rest of the world, it was a nightmare made flesh. In Washington, leaders gathered in emergency bunkers. The president vowed retaliation, declaring, "We will make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them." Within hours, the CIA traced the attacks to al-Qaeda's camps in Afghanistan. NATO invoked Article 5, Collective Defense, for the first time in its history. Across capitals, alliances hardened overnight. A global war was already taking shape. In Pakistan, Taliban envoys denied involvement, but refused to hand over Osama. Their defiance would soon bring war to their doorstep. Intelligence agencies worldwide began hunting the financiers, couriers, and planners behind the attacks. Flight manifests became evidence. Phone calls became trails. The modern era of counterterrorism was born that week. In the Middle East, reactions were mixed. Some mourned openly. Others cheered in anger at decades of Western dominance. In Muslim-majority nations, clerics condemned the act as un-Islamic, while radicals celebrated it as divine justice. The split revealed the depth of the ideological wound Osama had inflicted, one that cut through faith, politics, and conscience alike. From New York to Kabul, one truth echoed louder than all others. The world would never return to what it had been at dawn that day. The attack had not just toppled towers, it had redrawn history. In one morning, the sky had fallen, and a new era, defined by fear, vengeance, and endless war, had begun. December 2001, the mountains of eastern Afghanistan burned under American airstrikes. US and allied forces, aided by Afghan militias, closed in on the Tora Bora cave complex near the Pakistan border. Intelligence intercepts confirmed Osama bin Laden's voice, calm, commanding fighters to hold ground. Drones circled above, missiles struck valleys, but the mountains swallowed sound and heat. The world's most wanted man had become a shadow within stone. US troops searched ridge by ridge, using satellite maps and laser-guided bombs. Afghan warlords claimed to have him cornered, but winter and terrain conspired against precision. Bin Laden's convoy, a handful of men and mules, slipped through a gap in the White Mountains under cover of night. By the time the smoke cleared, the caves were empty, except for shell casings, ration tins, and verses scrawled on rock walls. Inside one of those caves, soldiers found a fragment of paper. "We love death as you love life." It was part defiance, part farewell. From Tora Bora, bin Laden crossed into Pakistan's tribal frontier, a region beyond maps, where loyalty was bought with silence. The US dropped thousands of leaflets offering millions for his capture, but no one came forward. The desert wind erased tracks faster than satellites could find them. In Washington, frustration deepened. Military commanders debated missed chances. Intelligence reports contradicted each other. Some believed he died in the bombardment, others that he fled to Karachi or Iran. But no body, no photograph, no voice message confirmed it. Osama bin Laden had simply vanished, a ghost whose absence haunted the world more than his presence ever had. For America, Tora Bora became a symbol of near victory, of unfinished war. The man who had brought the towers down had escaped, and the chase would shape the next decade. In that snowbound silence, a new war began, one not for territory, but for time itself. After Tora Bora, the world became a grid of suspicion and surveillance. The CIA, MI6, ISI, and dozens of other agencies formed the largest intelligence coalition in history. Satellites mapped tribal villages, phone intercepts traced couriers, and informants were paid in gold and visas. Each rumor sparked an operation. Each false lead deepened the myth. His face, bearded and still, stared from posters, news broadcasts, and embassy walls. The man who defined a decade by absence. The US invasion of Afghanistan morphed into the global war on terror. Armies chased phantoms across borders. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq diverted resources and attention, fracturing focus. Bin Laden became less a person than an idea, proof that America's wars could not catch their creator. His name was invoked by militants in Bali, Madrid, London, and Baghdad. He was nowhere, yet everywhere. Drone warfare replaced reconnaissance patrols. Eyes in the sky watched compounds in deserts. Missiles struck weddings mistaken for meetings, cars mistaken for convoys. Civilians died, resentment grew, and with every strike that missed, new followers rose. The pursuit of one man began spawning generations of men who claimed to follow him. The hunt entered bureaucratic twilight. Hundreds of videos were analyzed for shadows and dialects. In 2004, Osama released another tape, older, grayer, but alive. "Our war is economic," he declared, bleeding America to bankruptcy. His voice, crackling through poor audio, reignited old fear. Intelligence agencies realized something. Finding him was no longer about vengeance. It was about ending an era. By 2007, public faith in the hunt waned. Politicians promised results, soldiers returned home without answers. Yet somewhere in the intelligence chain, analysts still stared at heat maps and courier logs. They believed he was still close, perhaps even hiding in plain sight, and they were right. From 2005 onward, Osama bin Laden lived in the Pakistani garrison town of Abbottabad, just a short drive from a military academy. The compound that sheltered him was peculiar. High walls, no phone lines, and a burning pit where trash turned to smoke each night. Inside, he lived with his wives, children, and trusted couriers. The man who once commanded global networks now moved between two rooms, never stepping outside. He grew older, thinner. His beard dyed black for the few videos he released. He wrote letters instead of issuing decrees, warning his sons against television, against recklessness. His correspondence revealed contradictions, paranoia, paternal tenderness, and an obsession with image. "Stay faithful," he wrote, "but trust no one." The revolutionary had become a prisoner of his own secrecy. While his organization fractured, he micromanaged from isolation. He scolded subordinates for sloppy operations and urged restraint on civilian targets. In one memo, he lamented the killing of Muslims by jihadis, a rare glimpse of regret. Yet he still dreamt of another strike against America, something bigger than New York. His words were weary, but ambition still flickered. The compound's walls closed tighter as the years passed. He rarely saw the sky, fearing drones overhead. His children played quietly in courtyards, their laughter muffled by concrete. Outside those walls, al-Qaeda splintered, its commanders killed, its ideology diluted by younger radicals. The man who had inspired armies could no longer control them. By 2010, bin Laden was a relic, a living ghost. He followed news on an old television, watching the rise of revolts and leaders who no longer spoke his name. The Arab Spring had begun, and the world moved on without him. Yet, in the quiet of his study, he believed history was still waiting for his final act. On the night of May 1st, 2011, two stealth Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from Jalalabad, Afghanistan, carrying 23 Navy SEALs, a translator, and a military dog named Cairo. Their target? A mysterious compound in Abbottabad. Months of surveillance had tracked a courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, to that address. Inside, analysts believed, was the man they'd hunted for 10 years. The mission was codenamed Operation Neptune Spear. At 11 p.m. local time, one helicopter clipped a wall and crash-landed inside the compound. The SEALs continued the assault on foot. They breached the doors, clearing rooms floor by floor. Gunfire echoed through narrow hallways. In a dim bedroom on the 3rd floor, they found him. Older, unarmed, standing behind his wife. 2 shots ended the world's longest pursuit. Within minutes, they secured his body and gathered computers, drives, and handwritten letters. The helicopter wreckage was destroyed with explosives before the team exfiltrated. By 1 a.m., the compound was silent again. In Washington, the Situation Room watched live through satellite feed. When confirmation came, President Obama simply said, "We got him." The news broke just after midnight in the United States. Crowds gathered outside the White House, Ground Zero, and across cities, cheering, crying, waving flags. For some, it was closure. For others, only another chapter. In Abbottabad, neighbors awoke to explosions without knowing history had ended next door. At sea, 24 hours later, Osama bin Laden's body was buried according to Islamic rites. The ocean took him. No grave, no shrine, no monument. The man who had sought eternal fame vanished into the very element that cannot be claimed. The morning after his death, headlines read, "Justice done." But as the world exhaled, new questions rose. Had his death ended terror, or merely transformed it? Within months, al-Qaeda pledged new leaders, and fragments of his ideology reassembled under new names. From Iraq, a breakaway group emerged, ISIS, carrying his blueprint into a new century of violence. The myth proved stronger than the man. To millions, bin Laden was dead. To others, he became legend. His speeches circulated online, weaponized by recruits who never met him. Drone strikes continued. New wars erupted in Yemen, Syria, and the Sahel. The war on terror became permanent background noise, a machine that outlived its catalyst. In Washington, archives filled with his letters and drives. Analysts found no new plots, only fear, daily routines, and handwritten reminders to water plants. Behind the myth lay monotony, proof that history's most hunted man had died a tired, isolated soul. For the world, that truth was both comforting and tragic. A decade later, his children spoke quietly of a father who prayed often and trusted few. For them, he was not the mastermind of 9/11, but a man consumed by destiny and destroyed by it. In their memories, he had become both patriarch and prisoner. For historians, he became a mirror. What happens when belief becomes empire, and empire becomes belief? Even in death, Osama bin Laden's shadow lingered, not in caves or compounds, but in the echo of every act committed in his name. The man was gone. The idea remained, shapeless, surviving in anger, in ideology, in myth. And in that echo, the war he began continued, fought not in deserts, but in mines.